All right, so get ready because today we're going deep, deep into the JNK pathway.
Oh, this is going to be good.
You know,
Yeah, so it's fascinating stuff.
what is this JNK pathway? What are we talking about here?
Well, you can think of it like it's like a secret agent inside your cells, right? It plays a really important role in how your cells deal with stress. And it can even influence things like, chronic pain or even cancer.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is important stuff then.
Absolutely.
Like if it's dealing with chronic pain and cancer, we should probably understand it.
Yeah, it's like if you imagine your cells like bustling cities, right? They have all these communication networks constantly buzzing with information. And these networks are called signal transduction pathways, right? And the JNK pathway, that's one of the busiest streets in that city.
Okay, I kind of get the picture now.
Yeah.
But how did scientists even discover this JNK pathway? Like, did they just stumble upon it?
Well, it's a pretty cool story, actually. Scientists were initially trying to figure out how cannabinoids work in the body. You know, those compounds found in cannabis.
Right.
And for a long time, they thought that cannabinoids only interacted with these two main receptors, CB1 and CB2.
Okay.
But then they started to see these effects that they just couldn't explain with just those two receptors.
Really?
Yeah, so it was like a detective story, right?
Oh, interesting.
They had these clues that there was something else going on.
Behind the scenes.
Yeah, behind the scenes.
Okay.
So researchers, they started to dig deeper, looking for these other potential players in the cell that might be involved, right? And that's how they found the JNK pathway. It's like a whole new avenue of cellular communication that nobody even knew existed before.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
So they're looking at one thing, and then they find this whole other thing.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
It's like, yeah, sometimes you got to follow those breadcrumbs,
You find a whole new world.
Exactly.
So, okay, before we get too lost in the weeds here, can you give us the big picture? Like, what does this JNK pathway actually do?
Okay, so think about it this way. Your body has a natural stress response, right? Like if you're in a dangerous situation, your heart starts racing, your senses sharpen, right? That's your body's fight or flight response.
Right.
Well, your cells have their own version of this.
Oh, interesting.
And that's where the JNK pathway comes in.
So the JNK pathway is like the cell's internal fight or flight alarm.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
Okay.
So when a cell experiences any kind of stress, whether it's from heat or toxins or even signals from other cells, the JNK pathway gets activated. And this sets off a whole chain of events that helps the cell deal with whatever's going on.
So it's like a cellular emergency response team.
Yeah, you could say that.
All right, so what kind of emergencies does it handle?
Well, the JNK pathway, it's a bit of a multitasker, It's involved in inflammation, which is your body's way of protecting itself from injury and infection, right?
Right.
It also plays a role in apoptosis.
Apoptosis?
Yeah, which is basically programmed cell death.
Okay.
It's kind of like a way for the body to get rid of damaged or unnecessary cells.
So it's like a cleanup crew, too.
You could say that.
Wow, very efficient.
Yeah, and on top of that, it can even influence cell proliferation. Which is how cells divide and multiply.
Oh, okay.
So it's all about this careful balance between cell survival and cell death.
Wow, so this pathway is really busy then.
Yeah, it is.
It's doing a lot.
It's got its hands full.
But how does this all actually happen at the molecular level? Like, how does the JNK pathway actually get activated?
Okay, well, it's like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
You have a signal from outside the cell that triggers this cascade of events.
Okay, so something outside the cell flips the switch and turns it on. What kind of signals are we talking about?
Well, it really depends on what kind of stress the cell's experiencing.
Okay.
Like if you imagine a cell getting blasted by UV radiation from the sun or bombarded by these harmful free radicals, these are the type of things that can trigger that JNK pathway.
Okay, so the signal gets to the cell, but how does it get inside and actually activate that pathway?
Right, that's the really fascinating part.
Yeah.
It's not like the stress just walks right in, right?
Right.
Instead, it binds to a specific receptor on the cell surface.
Okay.
It's like ringing the doorbell.
So the receptor is like the cell's security system.
Exactly.
Sensing the danger outside.
And alerting the JNK pathway on the inside.
Okay, got it.
So once that receptor receives that signal, it starts this chain reaction inside the cell.
Okay.
Activating all these proteins called kinases.
Kinases.
Yeah, and you can think of these kinases like messengers, right?
Okay.
They're passing along that emergency signal one after the other.
So it's like a relay race. Each runner is a kinase, passing the baton, which is the signal.
That's a perfect analogy.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
What are the names of some of these runners, and how do they know where to go?
All right, so the first runner, that's a group of proteins called MAP kinases, or MAP3Ks.
MAP3Ks, all right.
Yeah. And they get the signal from the receptor, and they pass it on to the next runner,
Okay.
which is called MAP kinase kinases, or MAP2Ks.
MAP2s, okay.
Yeah, and then finally, the signal reaches the MAP kinases themselves, of which JNK is a star player.
Okay, hold on. MAP3K, MAP2K, JNK. It's a lot of kinases. Is there a simpler way to think about this?
Sure, yeah. Imagine a chain of command, like in the military.
Okay.
That initial signal, that's like an order from the highest ranking officer.
Okay.
And each kinase is like a soldier, passing that order down the line, amplifying the message as it goes.
Oh, okay, so it's like a game of telephone, but with serious consequences for the cell.
Exactly, high stakes.
Okay, so what happens when JNK finally gets the message?
Well, activated JNK, it acts like a molecular switch, turning on or off a whole bunch of other proteins within the cell.
Okay.
And these proteins are responsible for actually carrying out the cell's response to the stress, whether it's triggering inflammation, starting cell death, or even helping the cell to survive.
Wow, so JNK really is the conductor of this whole orchestra, coordinating everything.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Cool.
But here's the thing, right? This JNK pathway, it can't just be activated all the time.
Right, that would be bad.
Yeah, it would be chaos.
It needs brakes.
It needs to be carefully regulated.
Like a car's braking system.
Exactly.
All right, that makes sense. A cell in a constant state of emergency, that wouldn't be very productive.
No, not at all.
Okay, so how does the cell keep the JNK pathway in check?
Well, one way is through these proteins called phosphatases.
Phosphatases, what do they do?
They're kind of like the opposite of kinase.
Okay.
So remember how kinases pass the signal along and amplify it?
Yeah.
Well, phosphatases, they're like the signal stoppers.
Okay.
They remove these phosphate groups from proteins, which essentially deactivates them.
Ah, so they're like hitting the brakes on the JNK pathway.
Precisely.
Okay, so it doesn't get out of control.
Exactly.
Got it.
And there are other mechanisms, too. Like the cell can regulate the production and degradation of all the proteins involved in the JNK pathway, fine-tuning its activity, like a dimmer switch.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty elegant.
Okay, I'm starting to appreciate how complex this system is.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
All these molecules interacting, regulating each other. It's like a perfectly choreographed dance.
And understanding all these interactions is crucial.
Yeah.
Not just for understanding how cells work.
But also for potentially developing new therapies for diseases where this pathway goes wrong.
Now, you mentioned that scientists kind of stumbled upon this JNK pathway while they were researching cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm.
How does this pathway connect to other receptors like CB1, CB2, and even that serotonin receptor, 5-HT2A?
Okay, so remember those clues I was talking about? The ones that suggested there was more to the story than just CB1 and CB2 receptors?
Right.
Well, it looks like the JNK pathway might be one of the ways that these other receptors, including those non-classical cannabinoid receptors we talked about, are actually communicating with the cell.
So it's like the JNK pathway is like a central hub,
Yeah.
connecting all these different receptors and kind of coordinating their effects.
That's a great way to think about it.
It's cool.
And this is especially interesting when we consider the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids.
Right.
You see, activating certain cannabinoid receptors can actually trigger that JNK pathway, leading to a whole bunch of downstream effects.
So if we understand how this pathway interacts with these receptors, we could maybe develop better, more targeted therapies for conditions like chronic pain, even neurodegenerative diseases.
Exactly.
That's really exciting.
It is. And what's really cool is that these pathways, they don't work in isolation, right? They're all interconnected.
Like a big web.
Like a complex web of cellular communication.
Wow, this is really fascinating. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we're just getting started.
This is cool.
It is.
I'm already blown away.
So what's standing out to you so far? What's got you thinking?
Honestly, just how intricate and interconnected everything is at the cellular level. It's just amazing.
It is, right? It's like this incredible city with millions of moving parts all working together perfectly.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about all this is happening inside us right now.
It's happening right now all the time.
It's mind-blowing.
It is, and we're just beginning to understand it, which is what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned that this JNK pathway could hold clues to new therapies for conditions like chronic pain, neurodegenerative diseases. And that's something I'm really interested in, especially the role of cannabinoids in those areas. I was reading a study about how activating CB2 receptors can actually help protect brain cells from damage in Parkinson's disease.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example of how researchers are connecting the dots between these pathways and potential treatments.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about the JNK pathway being involved in both cell death and cell survival? Well, with Parkinson's, you see a lot of neuronal cell death,
Right.
which leads to those Parkinson's symptoms.
Right. The loss of those dopamine-producing neurons
Exactly.
causes the tremors and the movement problems.
Yeah, so how could activating CB2 receptors and potentially influencing that JNK pathway offer some protection?
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
Well, it seems that activating CB2 receptors can actually reduce the inflammatory response in the brain.
Okay.
And remember, inflammation, that's one of the key processes regulated by the JNK pathway.
Right, right.
So by controlling that inflammatory response, CB2 activation might actually be able to shield those vulnerable neurons from more damage.
Ah, okay. So it's like putting a fire extinguisher on the inflammation that's contributing to the cell death.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how these receptors can have such a big impact on the brain.
It is. It is. And cannabinoids aren't just limited to protecting the brain, right?
No, not at all.
They also show promise in treating chronic pain conditions. And that's something I'm really interested in, too.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I was reading about how some people use cannabis to manage chronic pain,
Mm-hmm.
and I was curious about the science behind it.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that cannabinoids can actually target the pathways involved in pain perception?
There is. There's actually a lot of research suggesting that cannabinoids, especially the ones that activate CB1 receptors, can interfere with pain signals as they travel from the body to the brain.
Oh,
It's like they're intercepting those messages before they reach their destination.
so they're cutting off the communication lines of pain.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But I also remember reading something about cannabinoids having potential in cancer treatment.
Right.
How does that fit into the picture?
That's another area where cannabinoids are showing some real promise.
Oh.
And it might seem counterintuitive, right? Because we were just talking about how they can protect neurons.
Yeah.
But cannabinoids can actually also promote cell death, particularly in cancer cells.
Whoa. So they can be both protectors and destroyers.
Exactly. They're quite versatile.
How does that work?
Well, remember how we talked about the JNK pathway being involved in apoptosis, that programmed cell death?
Right.
Well, it seems that certain cannabinoids can trigger this pathway specifically in cancer cells, leading to their, well, demise.
Oh, wow. So they're selectively targeting those bad cells.
Yeah, it's like they can distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys.
So they're leaving the healthy cells unharmed.
Exactly.
That's incredible. So could cannabinoids potentially be used to both treat and prevent cancer?
Well, the research is still ongoing, but the early findings are really encouraging.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's a very exciting area of research.
Yeah.
And their potential goes beyond just cancer.
Really?
Yeah, cannabinoids have also shown promise in treating things like multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, even some psychiatric disorders.
Wow, it seems like the possibilities are pretty vast then.
They are, but of course there are still challenges. One of the biggest challenges is really understanding the complexity of this endocannabinoid system and how it interacts with all these other pathways like the JNK pathway.
Yeah, it's like a huge web with all these different threads, right?
Exactly, and we're just starting to unravel it all.
Yeah.
And we also have to consider the potential for personalized medicine with cannabinoids.
Right, because everyone's different.
Everyone's different, and I know you were reading about how genetic variations can influence how people respond to these compounds.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking, imagine being able to analyze someone's genes and predict how they'll respond to different cannabinoids or even different dosages.
That would be incredible, right?
Yeah.
It would revolutionize treatment, making it so much more targeted and effective.
Yeah, no more trial and error, just a personalized plan.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
It is. And with advancements in genetic testing and our understanding of the endocannabinoid system, that future is becoming closer.
I love it. I love the future of personalized medicine. It just makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's really exciting.
So this has been an incredible journey so far
It has.
into the world of cannabinoids and their potential.
Mm-hmm.
And it all started with this JNK pathway.
That's right.
It's amazing how one discovery can open up so much possibility.
Absolutely. And remember, we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to explore, from the intricate workings of cannabinoids to the potential of personalized medicine.
I'm ready for it.
Me too.
But before we go too far, I want to switch gears a bit and talk about another player in cellular stress responses, the P38 pathway.
Oh, yeah, P38.
You mentioned it earlier, and it sounds like a close relative of JNK.
It is. They're like siblings.
Oh, okay.
They have some similarities, but also some key differences.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how does this P38 pathway fit into this bigger picture of cellular communication and stress response?
Well, if you think of the JNK pathway as like a first responder rushing to the scene of a cellular emergency,
Okay.
the P38 pathway is more like a seasoned detective,
Okay.
carefully analyzing the situation and coordinating the long-term response.
So they both deal with stress, but they have different approaches.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. What kind of situations does the P38 pathway specialize in?
Well, it's really important in regulating inflammation, just like JNK,
Where?
but it also plays a key role in things like cell differentiation, which is how cells develop into specialized types,
Okay.
and cell cycle control, which is how cells grow and divide.
So it's not just about responding to immediate threats.
No.
It's about long-term health and development of the cell.
Exactly. It's thinking ahead.
I like it. Long-term planning.
Exactly.
So is P38 activated by the same kind of signals as JNK?
Yeah, a lot of the same signals, things like inflammatory cytokines, those signaling molecules in the immune response,
Okay.
and oxidative stress,
Okay.
which is caused by too many free radicals in the cell.
So they respond to similar signals, but then they have different downstream effects.
Right, they have different jobs to do.
What makes the P38 pathway unique in how it responds?
Well, one key difference is in the proteins it interacts with and activates.
Okay.
While JNK mainly targets transcription factors, those proteins that control gene expression,
Okay.
P38 has a wider range of targets,
Okay.
including enzymes, structural proteins, even other signaling molecules.
Wow, so it's got a bigger network then.
Yeah, it's a real social butterfly.
So it can influence a lot more processes.
Exactly, and all those interactions contribute to its role in those long-term responses to stress.
That's incredible. So it's like P38 is both a firefighter and an architect.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Dealing with immediate problems, but also planning for the future.
It's got a long-term vision.
I like it.
Yeah.
So given that it's involved in so many important things, what happens if P38 gets dysregulated?
Well, just like with the JNK pathway, if P38 isn't working properly, it can lead to problems.
Okay.
We're talking about things like inflammatory disorders, cardiovascular disease, even cancer.
Wow, so it's really important that it's functioning properly. This makes me wonder about the potential for targeting P38 therapeutically.
Mm.
Are there any drugs or therapies being developed that focus on this pathway?
There are, actually. Researchers are really interested in the therapeutic potential of modulating the P38 pathway,
Okay.
and several P38 inhibitors are currently in clinical trials
Oh, wow.
for conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease.
Oh, okay.
The idea is that by kind of dialing down that excessive P38 activity, we might be able to control the inflammation and reduce the symptoms.
That's really cool. So the more we understand these pathways, the more we can develop new treatments.
Exactly. And the more we learn, the more we realize how interconnected everything is.
Right.
There's even evidence suggesting that the JNK and P38 pathways can actually influence each other.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, creating this complex web of signaling that fine-tunes how the cell responds to stress.
So they're like having a conversation,
They're talking to each other.
making sure everything's running smoothly.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Like a beautiful system.
It is. It is. This has been an incredible deep dive so far.
Yes.
Into the world of cellular stress response.
Mm-hmm.
From that emergency response team of JNK to the long-term planning of P38.
Yeah, they're both essential.
It's amazing to think about how much is happening inside each of our cells,
Right. All the time.
constantly working to keep us healthy and functioning.
It's a marvel of nature.
It really is. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
We've talked about how stress can activate these pathways, but what about positive things? Could things like exercise or meditation also influence these pathways in a good way? I'm really curious about that.
That's a great question, and it really highlights the importance of that mind-body connection,
Yeah.
even at the cellular level.
Exactly. So that's something for our listeners to ponder.
Something to explore.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive
It's been my pleasure.
into the JNK and P38 pathways.
Fascinating stuff.
It really is. And I hope you've gained a new appreciation for how complex and resilient your cells are.
Absolutely. And remember, the journey doesn't end here.
Right.
Keep asking questions, stay curious. You never know what you might discover.
I love it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Honestly, it's blowing my mind, like how intricate and interconnected everything is at the cellular level.
I know, right?
It's like a city with millions of moving parts,
Billions.
all working together in this like crazy complex symphony.
That's what makes it so captivating, you know? It's like we're piecing together this giant puzzle.
Yeah.
And every piece we uncover, it's like, oh, wow, there's even more complexity to life than we thought.
And speaking of puzzles, you mentioned that this JNK pathway might hold clues to new therapies for things like chronic pain, neurodegenerative diseases.
Right.
And that's something I'm super interested in, especially the role of cannabinoids in those areas.
Yeah.
You know, I was reading this study about how activating CB2 receptors can actually help protect brain cells from damage in Parkinson's disease.
Oh, that's a great example of how research is starting to connect those dots between these pathways and potential treatments.
Yeah.
Remember, we talked about the JNK pathway being involved in both cell death and cell survival.
Right.
Well, in Parkinson's, you see a lot of neuronal cell death, which contributes to the symptoms of the disease.
Right. The loss of those dopamine-producing neurons is what causes the tremors and the movement problems.
Exactly.
So how could activating CB2 receptors and maybe influencing the JNK pathway offer protection?
Well, it seems like activating those CB2 receptors can actually dampen down that inflammatory response in the brain.
Okay.
And remember, inflammation is one of those key processes regulated by JNK.
Right.
So by modulating that response, CB2 activation might be able to actually shield those vulnerable neurons from further damage.
Ah, so it's like putting a fire extinguisher on the inflammation that's contributing to neuronal death.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Okay, cool.
And what's even more fascinating is that cannabinoids aren't just limited to protecting the brain.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're also showing promise in treating those chronic pain conditions that you were talking about.
Yeah.
What specifically caught your eye about that?
Well, I was reading about how some people use cannabis to manage their chronic pain.
Yeah.
And I was really curious about the science behind it. Like, is there actual evidence that cannabinoids can target the pathways that are involved in pain perception?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of research suggesting that cannabinoids, particularly the ones that activate CB1 receptors, can actually interfere with pain signals as they travel from the body to the brain.
Okay.
It's like they're intercepting those messages before they even get there.
Wow. So it's like cutting off the communication lines of pain.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
That's amazing. But I also remember reading something about cannabinoids maybe having potential in cancer treatment.
Right.
How does that fit into all of this?
That's another really exciting area of research. And it might seem counterintuitive, considering we were just talking about how they can protect neurons. But cannabinoids can actually also promote cell death, but specifically in cancer cells.
Whoa, so they can be both protectors and destroyers.
Exactly. They're pretty versatile.
How does that work?
Well, remember when we talked about the JNK pathway being involved in apoptosis, that programmed cell death?
Yeah.
Well, it seems that certain cannabinoids can actually trigger that pathway specifically in those cancer cells.
Okay.
Leading to their, well, their demise.
So they're like selectively targeting those bad cells.
Yeah, like they can tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys.
Leaving the healthy cells unharmed.
Exactly.
That's incredible. So cannabinoids could potentially be used to both treat and prevent cancer.
Well, like I said, the research is ongoing, but the early findings are really promising.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
It seems like the possibilities are pretty much endless.
They're pretty vast.
But I imagine there are still a lot of challenges.
Of course, of course. I mean, one of the biggest ones is just understanding the complexity of the endocannabinoid system and how it interacts with all these other pathways, like the JNK pathway. It's a massive web.
With countless threads, right.
Exactly. And we're just starting to figure it all out.
And we haven't even touched on personalized medicine with cannabinoids yet.
Oh, right. That's a huge area, too.
Yeah. I was reading about how genetic variations can influence how people respond to those compounds.
Oh, absolutely.
And I was thinking, like, imagine if you could analyze someone's genetic profile and predict how they'll respond to different cannabinoids or even dosages.
That would be amazing.
Right.
It would be like a revolution in how we treat people.
Yeah.
Making it so much more targeted and effective.
No more trial and error, just personalized therapy.
Yeah, that's the dream.
That's the future I'm excited about.
And it's getting closer and closer.
I love it.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
This has been an incredible journey so far.
It has.
Into the world of cannabinoids and their potential.
It's a fascinating world.
It really is. And it all started with that JNK pathway.
That's right.
It's amazing how one discovery can just unlock so much possibility.
It's true. It's like opening a door to a whole new universe.
Yeah.
And remember, we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, I know.
There's so much more to explore, you know, from the intricacies of how cannabinoids work to the potential of personalized medicine.
I'm excited to see where it all goes.
Me too, me too.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to shift gears just a little bit
Okay.
and talk about another key player in cellular stress responses,
Right.
the P38 pathway.
Ah, yes, P38.
You mentioned it earlier, and it sounds like it's a close relative of the JNK pathway.
It is. It is. They're like siblings, you know?
Oh, okay.
They share some similarities, but they also have their own unique roles and responsibilities.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how does this P38 pathway fit into the bigger picture of cellular communication and the stress response?
Well, it's like if you think about JNK as the first responder, rushing to the scene of like a cellular emergency.
All right.
P38 is more like a detective,
Okay.
carefully analyzing the situation, figuring out the long-term response.
So they both deal with stress,
Yeah,
but they have different approaches.
exactly.
All right, that's cool.
Yeah.
What kind of situations does P38 specialize in?
P38 is really important for regulating inflammation,
Okay, like JNK.
just like JNK.
Yeah.
But it also plays a big role in cell differentiation.
Okay.
How cells develop into their specialized types, and cell cycle control,
Okay.
how cells grow and divide.
So it's not just about, like you said, responding to the immediate threat.
Right.
It's about managing the long-term health and development.
It's thinking ahead.
P38's got a plan.
It's got a plan.
So is it activated by the same kind of signals as JNK?
Yeah, pretty much. A lot of the same things.
Okay.
Like those inflammatory cytokines and signaling molecules in the immune response.
Okay.
And oxidative stress, which is when you have too many free radicals in the cell.
Okay, so they respond to similar signals but have different effects downstream.
Yeah, they have different jobs.
What makes P38 so unique in how it responds?
Well, one big difference is in the proteins it interacts with and activates. JNK mainly targets transcription factors, which are those proteins that control gene expression.
Right.
P38 has a much wider range of targets. Enzymes, structural proteins, even other signaling molecules.
Wow, so it's got a bigger network.
It's a social butterfly.
It can influence a lot more then.
Exactly, and all those interactions are really important for that long-term response.
That's pretty cool. So it's like P38 is a firefighter and an architect,
I like that analogy.
putting out fires, but also planning for the future.
Yeah, it's got a vision.
What happens if P38 gets dysregulated?
Well, just like with JNK, if it's not working right, it can cause problems.
Okay.
Things like inflammatory disorders, cardiovascular disease, even cancer.
Wow, so it's really important. It's working,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
It is.
This makes me wonder about targeting P38 therapeutically.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any drugs or therapies in development that focus on P38?
There are, yeah. Researchers are really interested in that,
Oh.
the therapeutic potential there.
Yeah.
And there are actually several P38 inhibitors in clinical trials right now
Oh, wow.
for things like rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease.
Okay.
The idea is if we can dial down that P38 activity,
Yeah.
we can maybe control the inflammation and ease the symptoms.
That's really cool. So the more we understand these pathways, the better the treatments we can develop.
Exactly. And the more we learn, the more we realize how connected it all is.
Right.
There's even evidence JNK and P38 influence each other.
Really?
Yeah. It's like a web, fine-tuning the stress response.
We're having a conversation?
Yeah, they're talking.
Making sure everything's running smoothly.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
It's a beautiful system.
This has been an incredible deep dive
It has been.
into the world of cellular stress response, JNK and P38.
There's
It's amazing to think how much is going on in our cells right now,
all the time.
keeping us healthy and functioning.
It's remarkable.
It really is.
Yeah.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought.
Great.
We talked about how stress can activate these pathways,
Yeah.
but what about positive things? Could exercise or meditation influence these pathways in a good way?
That's a great question. Really shows how important the mind-body connection is.
Right, even at the cellular level.
Exactly.
So that's something for our listeners to ponder.
Keep exploring.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into JNK and P38.
My pleasure.
I hope you've learned something new and have a greater appreciation for just how complex and resilient your cells are.
They're amazing little machines.
They are. And remember, the journey doesn't stop here.
No,
Wow.
it doesn't. Keep asking questions. Stay curious. You never know what you might discover.
I love it. Thanks again.
Thank you.